This is a 4th of July lecture in Jerusalem, and I want to address something that should be addressed by many, many people who care about Israel and also care about the United States. I'm David Bedein. I've been in Israel for 53 years, and I've gained some perspective, first working as a social work professor and then as a journalist. And there's ways in which Israel can declare independence and remain friends with the U.S. It doesn't have to be a war, but it takes a certain amount of assertiveness and understanding of history. Now, the Israel Declaration of Independence, which occurred, of course, on May 14, 1948, was prefaced by 6 months in which the United States State Department carried out a series of moves to try to prevent that from happening. In March of 1948, the U.S. State Department even tried to remove the Partition Resolution 181, and it even gained traction in the UN. Why did it happen? The Russian veto. There was a Russian veto led by Andrei Gromyko, who prevailed over United States Secretary of State George Marshall, who wanted to remove Israel's Declaration of Independence. Now, the U.S. during the war in 1948 not only forbade U.S. aid to Israel, but also forbade private citizens from sending money for weapons. Now, the U.S. did not interfere with the 3,000 fighters from the U.S. who volunteered here, of whom 268 were killed. Now, in the early 1950s, the United States tried to enforce clauses and terms of the 1949 Rhodes Accord, which formally put an end to Israel's War of Independence, and it began to implement certain aspects of the 1949 Rhodes Accords, which forbid settlement activity in the Negev and in the Galil. And the U.S. was always very ambivalent about that. The Shomer HaTzair movement, in support of the American position, gave out leaflets at the airport telling people not to settle in the disputed territories of the Negev. Now, the man to stand up against this U.S. Anti-Negev policy was none other than David Ben-Gurion, who told people who did, by example, move his home in 1953 to, of course, Staple Care. Very, very interesting. Now, what happened between 1951 and 1953? There was a tremendous, massive effort to move Jews into the Negev and to move Arabs out of the Negev. Now, this wasn't done through force of arms. It was done through many administrative procedures. I had the opportunity to interview Colonel Mordechai Mordechai Baron, who was in charge of that process. Now, again, things weren't being done by force, and the United States was rather passive. The United States, of course, was involved with the Korean War at the time, so they did not interfere with the process. And the growth of Beersheba, Ashkelon, Ashdod was due, of course, to the influx of Olim and the outflux, if you want to call it that, of Jews of Arabs who lived in Beersheba, Ashkelon, and a few other places in the Negev. So there was a kind of an exchange of populations. Now, when John Foster Dulles became the Secretary of State in 1953, he was upset to see what had happened, that Israel had created facts on the ground that really allowed this to happen. But again, there was no choice. The Korean War had happened, and this led, however, to a very strong position of Dulles, anti-Israel, not allowing pro-Israel activities to go on, certain vindictiveness on the part of the State Department, and Israel was alone. On the other hand, there were terror attacks coming, of course, from Egypt, Bedein, and Israel fought back and of course captured the Sinai. Now, Israel left the Sinai by force of the United States with the support of the Soviet Union in 1957, and that, of course, happened because the United States did not want, in a sense, an independent Israel acting in that way. So that was the first act against Israel's independence in the modern era, forcing Israel out of the Sinai. Now, Dwight Eisenhower was asked, and years later, it appears in the biography of Max Fisher, that this was one of his greatest mistakes, forcing Israel out of the Sinai. But again, it happened. It was a challenge to Israel's independence, and it led to, of course, the Six-Day War, because Israel's fragility after the 56, after the Israel's withdrawal from Sinai, it left it open, now there were supposed to be guarantees. Now, one thing that was, as a child in going to Hebrew school and following Israel history at the time, we learned at the time that there were guarantees, and that's why Israel was ready to leave the Sinai. However, when Nasser, the head of Egypt, on May 19, 1967, asked for the withdrawal of the UN peacekeepers team and the restoration of Egypt's antagonistic policies, Abba Eban flies to the United States. He was the foreign minister. As a high school student, I met him when he came to Philadelphia, my hometown, and he reported to us students that those guarantees didn't exist. And we were rather surprised by that, but that's what we had been told. That this was, the entire Israel community had been told that there were guarantees from the United States that if Israel were to be attacked or put under siege, and that American ships would go up and down the Straits of Tiran. But again, there were no guarantees. It was basically a hoax. Ironically, the man in the Israel politics who promoted the concept of this supposed guarantees was Shimon Peres, who was the deputy director of the Israel Ministry of Defense. Later on, he was criticized for pulling many tricks, in a sense, in Israeli foreign policy, but this was his first. So again, the American withdrawal, the American forced Israeli withdrawal from the Sinai was what caused, of course, the Six-Day War 11 years later, and again, it was American pressure that did that. Now, of course, Israel fighting heroically in the '67 war was followed, however, by the War of Attrition in '67 to '70. I arrived here in 1970, and the first experience yours truly had with this issue was witnessing the Rogers Accord, the Rogers Deal, the Rogers Agreement, where Israel would withdraw from the Suez Canal, and Egypt would withdraw from the Suez Canal, and this would be the beginning of a peace process. Within one day, the Egyptians moved up their troops. Now, my first letter home, August 31st, 1970, my 20th birthday, I wrote that, well, I guess the Egyptians are going to sit there for 3 years and then attack. But but from the point of view of people in Israel, it was happy days are here again. We don't have the pressure again from this war of attrition and the heavy penalties we were paying. I had no idea at the time, neither did anyone else, the extent to which Israel was suffering casualties, because that was censored. Only very recently was it revealed that 980 Israeli soldiers, were killed in the war of attrition. A tremendous amount of people with a country that had not reached the 3 million threshold as a population. But again, the U.S. pushed Israel's hand, and in signing the Rogers Agreement, the Rogers Accord, whatever you want to call it. And Rogers was the Secretary of State, and that's what caused, of course, the Yom Kippur War. Because the Yom Kippur War was based on the fact that Israel had let its defenses down. Now, one of the things that influenced Israel to agree to it was the unprecedented grant of $500 million to Israel from the United States. And sometimes you think that if you're getting that kind of an award, it'll be okay. But it was a challenge once again to Israel's independence. So the Yom Kippur War breaks out. Israel fights back in heroic ways that we have 50 years later. We're still understanding. We're still counting the miracles of what happened in that war. Now that produced, however, because the Americans and Russians were involved in that process, a new effort to push Israel away from its independence. And that's what created, of course, the Camp David Accord. Now, the Camp David Accord had two aspects of the accord which challenged Israel's independence, which were, number one, the allowance for a Palestinian Arab army. They called it a strong police force. And the second issue was, of course, the recognition of the Palestinian Arab national rights. Now, what that did was to bring in all the people who supported the PLO, so long as the PLO wouldn't be terrorists. So again, that was able. A whole process was begun there, the legitimization of an arch enemy of Israel, which had the PLO covenant still in force, and the 1964 war against Israel still in force, but Israel didn't pay attention to it. And so what's ironic is that the person who wrote the Camp David Accord, who really authored it, was Aaron Barak, who was, of course, the Attorney General, who later on became the head of the Israel Supreme Court. And the Israel Supreme Court, of course, gave sanction to the PLO and to the idea. I was part, because our agency, I run a news agency, and we do research stories. And one of our points of research was the Palestine security services, which were financed and organized in part by Israel. That we would have a Palestinian armed force that would be strong and therefore protect the peace. Well, that was a myth, but it cost Israel a very, very terrible price, which Israel is paying today in terms of its sovereignty and its independence, because the courts then began to rule in favor of a Palestinian Arab entity, in favor of in 2006, there was a landmark decision by the Israel Supreme Court supporting the idea of a Palestinian national army, which would patrol along Israel's borders and also inside Judea, Samaria, and Gaza, and not in Jerusalem, but still this was a chance that Israel took. The U.S. was pushing it very hard because the U.S. felt responsible for the Camp David Accords, and Aaron Barak, who was the minister, the Attorney General, and then became as I mentioned before, became the head of the Supreme Court. He pushed it as a legal precedent. Now, all this led to the 1991 Madrid Accords. Now, the Madrid Accords didn't push Israel in a way, but they did allow the PLO to come in as a partner, even though they were part of the Jordanian delegation. Now, that happened. How did the PLO come into Israel, into the U.S. Dealing with Israel? Well, one of the interviewees, I conducted an interview with someone by the name of Alan Keyes, who was the Undersecretary of State for Interorganizational Affairs under Reagan, a black fellow who was witness one day when the Saudis came into the White House without an appointment, made a beeline to the Oval Office and said to President Reagan, "You have to recognize the PLO, or we'll move our assets from the U.S. to, let's say, to Switzerland." In other words, there was a threat, and it wasn't done because of Palestinian human rights or anything like that. It was a straight understanding that we in Saudi Arabia are sponsoring the PLO, and we want the United States to put its strength behind this, and that's what happened. So the PLO became a factor to deal with from several points of view, as I'm mentioning the Camp David Accord, and then the Madrid Summit, where the PLO is actually recognized. But behind this is Reagan, and behind the Reagan recognition of the PLO is Saudi pressure. Now, the recognition, this recognition of the PLO became the U.S. precedent for the 1993 Oslo Accords, which were called the Declaration of Principles, signed in the White House on September 13th, 1993. However, and this is the big however, the U.S. and even Israel somehow ignored the fact that Arafat and the PLO never ratified the Declaration of Principles. Never ratified the Declaration of Principles. Very important to know that the Declaration of Principles, which was that the PLO would recognize Israel and would denounce terror, was never ratified by the main body called the Fatah. How do I know? Because at the time we were working with a journalist, and we still work with a journalist named Pinchas Inbari, who was working with a left-wing newspaper called Al-Mishmar, and he went to Tunis to witness the signing ceremony when the Arafat's people in the PLO, the Fatah, would agree would actually ratify the Oslo Accord. Well, the ratification never happened. And the other thing that never happened was the cancellation of the PLO covenant. The PLO covenant, and what's that? That's a PLO covenant, which is a permanent declaration of war to liquidate Israel. When was that adopted? Back in 1964, and that was not changed. That was not modified.
Why not?
There was a decision on April 24th, 1996. The Palestine National Council gathered for a special meeting to to discuss the Palestinian covenant. Our agency sent a crew, an Arab crew, to film it, and we had the only film there. The only film that existed is the one that we took, and they made a decision that we want to continue. Basically, we want to continue the war. However, that was downplayed, ignored, and as a matter of fact, there was the great lie promoted by, amongst other people, Martin Indyk, who was the U.S. ambassador to Israel, and by Shimon Peres, who was then the Prime Minister of Israel. So we put out a special video about that. Our agency, the Israel Resource News Agency, working with our Center for Near East Policy Research.
Can you just talk a little bit slower?
Sure,
I'm sorry.
That's okay. Again, let me say it very, very clearly that the PLO covenant was not canceled. That was a part of the Declaration of Principles. The Declaration of Principles from the Oslo Accord was also not ratified. In other words, it was there. It was agreed on the White House lawn with a signature. Everyone witnessed it. Abbas was there. Arafat was there. Rabin, of course, was there. Peres was there. The Russian delegation was there. But they were all there. And it was premised on the Israel Knesset adopting it, ratifying it, and the PNC, the Palestine National Council, adopted it. The Israel Knesset passed it 61 to 50, and the PLO did not ratify it. Finished. So there was never an accord. Now, at the time, I quipped a statement and said, well, maybe Arafat is the Woodrow Wilson of the Palestinian Arab entity. He proposed an accord, it wasn't accepted, so I just thought naively, well, that's the end of the peace process. Well, that's not what happened. What happened was that Peres, as the foreign minister, and in a sense, the doyen of the peace process, he sent his assistant, his deputy minister, Yossi Beilin, to Tunis to thank Arafat for ratifying an accord which he never ratified. And that's remained the situation to this day. Now, that led to other issues which are even more traumatic. In 2015, the PLO, they have a legislature and they have now a legal system, but the PLO became, of course, the PA, the Palestine Authority, to be accepted in the world of nations. And in that world of nations, they adopted a law, an unprecedented law, that if you murder a Jew, you get a salary for life. Now, it was hard to believe, so we hired an Arab.
What year was that?
August 15th, 2015. We hired an Arab journalist to go to the Palestinian Ministry of Justice and get a hold of that law, which we did. We published it, and it's published today by the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs here in Jerusalem, so anyone can see it. It's a very clear law that if you murder a Jew, you get a salary for life. Now, it's been we've confronted a series of Israeli governments on this issue, and all the Israeli governments say, oh, we condemn that law. I'm not asking if you condemn the law, I'm asking if you're going to ask it to be repealed. No request at this point in time has been made by any funder of the PA or by the Israel government to repeal the law. And that's where Israel on its own loses its independence. Now the time has come for Israel to assert its independence, not only in that area, but also you take something like the Levi aircraft. Israel developed an independent aircraft, which was not dependent on the United States, and Israel took unilateral action, of course, in 2005, to expel the Jewish population of Gush Katif and part of the northern Shomron. Now, the one rabbi who had a good relationship with Arik Sharon, his name was Rabbi Shari Shuv Cohen, who was the rabbi of Haifa, and he met with Arik Sharon a few days before the expulsions from Gush Katif and the Jewish community in Gaza. And Sharon pulled the document out of his glossaire of documents and said, here it is. What is that? A dictate from the United States Secretary of State, who at the time was Condoleezza Rice, that you must get the Jews out of Gaza by August 20th. That's it. A dictate. And that's how Israel loses its independence. Now, the idea is though like this. Israel now is under pressure from the United States government not to challenge the pay-for-slay legislation, even though it's part of American legislation now too. Not to enforce it, not to make an issue of it. And this is where the this is the rub challenging Israel's independence. Because if Israel tomorrow morning were to make an issue out of this, out of the legislation, unprecedented legislation that the PLO has passed through the Palestinian Authority, that if you murder a Jew, you get a salary for life, no one in the world would stop it. But Israel hasn't done it, because what's more important to Israel, to the people running Israel at this point, are the economic benefits accrued to Israel industries who are invested in the Palestinian Authority. And that's more important to the people running the country right now. And that's what needs to be challenged. If Israel does challenge this, the United States government will not object. I've been to the United States Congress more than a dozen times personally, and now through Zoom I'm in touch with members of Congress on both sides of the aisle. There's no one who would object if Israel were to say, we will not continue this process as long as this law continues. If you murder a Jew, you get a salary for life. And if Israel maintains its credibility and its integrity, it can maintain its relationship with the United States without any sanction whatsoever. Basically, what the U.S. does is contacts corporations, businesses, organizations that favor a fait accompli, what's the word? An arrangement, a laissez-faire arrangement. Just leave things alone, it'll be okay. As long as the economy does well, everything will be fine. Well, someone wrote me today, well, the economy is just doing great amongst the Palestinian Arabs. And then I pointed out to him that there's 6.7 million Arabs in UNRWA Arab refugee camps, in what we call refugeehood for perpetuity. And they're there under the premise and promise of what they call the right of return by force of arms. Now, so long as Israel doesn't challenge that, we're in trouble. Israel's in trouble. And I want to point out a brand new, renewed school book, which was, I've shown this before in sessions that I've given. What's important, Manish to know, what's new. This is a school book which teaches children to revere the legacy of Dalal al-Mughrabi, who murdered 36 Jews, attacking a school bus in 1978. This is a picture, there's 3 pages, how the children have to grow up to be like her. Manish said, what's new? This is the 2023 edition. If the camera was a different kind of camera, we would focus on it. 2023. It's a new book. And no one asked it to be removed. Well, the time has come to ask it to be removed, because that's a challenge to Israeli sovereignty. To Israel's sovereignty, having a book like this, and having a law, as I mentioned before, that if you murder a Jew, you get a salary for life. No one in the United States, no one in any Western country, no one in any civilized country would object if Israel were to raise these issues. And there's the rub.
How come nobody is saying anything about it?
I ask that question all the time. In other words, a problem is a problem when someone makes it into a problem. Find me one Jewish organization, find me one diplomat, but we did find a member of Congress who made an issue out of it, Senator James Risch, senator from...
How do you spell that?
R-I-S-C-H.
R-I-S-C-H. He was the only one who made an issue out of it?
Yes. And Senator Risch is the ranking Republican of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Let me wind up this aspect of my discussion by saying that if people, the question was just asked, why isn't anyone making an issue out of it? That's what I ask. And we have to find, if we can find the funds to have a public lecture in major places, at the National Press Club in Washington, or at the Press Club in Jerusalem, we can do it. Finding anyone to put money up for programs like this is almost impossible. But I'm not giving up. The message today is I'm not giving up.
How much is needed?
As much as we can get. But I'm saying that if we have $10,000, we can do a good job in terms of initial public relations to put this out. That's it. Thank you again for those of you who came to the discussion or had seen this movie will be seen around the world. Behind the Scene with David Bedein, July 4th, 2023. And all I can say is, it's not a lonely battle, it's a necessary battle, because if you don't have education for peace, you have education for war. Thank you.